Sharon and today we're going to paint a scoop plate that I call Pine Tree Lane. Notice that there's no strong ridges or rims on this plate so that your design can simply flow over the edge of the plate without any interruptions. We're going to be using an assortment of deco art paints today and an assortment of brushes. First of all, this large round brush you can think of as wetting a surface and also erasing mistakes. These two liner brushes, one with longer hair is for doing longer strokes, the other shorter hair for doing finer detailing. We have an assortment of angle brushes, which will be perhaps floating some color or putting some washes on, and with that high corner we're able to get in any tight, narrow areas without any problems. And I'm also introducing two new brushes to you. They're my technique brushes. This first one is Sharon B's Crown. Notice the shape of the brush. It has been tiered and it's rounded at the tip so that you may use all areas and surface of this brush depending on your application. This one I call the Blade. It has an oval chisel edge and flat sides of which we can use at any time we need to dry brush or wet on wet paint. And for more delicate applications, we'll be using the pointed tip of this brush. Let's get started with our painting. As you can see, I have based in my house and my barn and my horizon line. Notice that I also carried this heavier paint around the perimeter of the buildings. This will keep us from putting our background trees onto the buildings, and it kind of steadies your mind to know, don't pass that line. So let's get started. First of all, I have to put on my granny glasses so I can see that finer detail. We're going to start up in the sky with some clouds. We're going to start out with our largest angle brush. We're going to dampen it in water, pick up some blue mist, work it on the palette to a thin application of approximately 50% paint to 50% water. Work it well into the bristles so you have a fully loaded brush. Come up to the surface, dampen this upper portion of the sky. I can see I need a bit more water. Notice that this plate has been prepared with a base coat of blue-gray mist. This is a snow scene, so you want to keep it nice and cool. And by applying this blue-gray color, it will be shining through or showing through many of the applications of paint we'll be using today and keep this a cool value painting. Now while this is damp, I'm going to pick up the crown brush. I'm going to move over to my palette into Highlight Flesh, and I'm going to roll the brush in the paint. Just on the edge of the puddle of paint, I'm picking up quite a considerable amount of paint. And because this is natural bristle, it will hold the paint for longer periods of time than a synthetic brush would. Come over to the dampened surface, and in semicircular motions, start to place in your clouds. Now think of these as puffy masses. And as the paint leaves the brush, these are your more distant clouds. So you can continue to move across the surface, forming these cloud-like masses. Go back, reload your brush by rolling it on the edge of the paint. Come back to the surface, drop down to a slightly different location, and place in these clouds. Notice I start with a slightly larger form and then slowly taper off the sides. I think it has a slightly more natural look this way. And there's quite a bit of texture to the paint because I've picked up a considerable amount and really fully loaded these bristles. I'm going to put the brush down and pick up this dampened brush that we placed our sky in with, our sky color. And I'm going to pick up a paper towel and blot some of the excess paint off of the brush. I'm going to come back up and with a very soft, pulling, dragging stroke, soften out the base of some of these clouds. Give them a little bit more of a natural look. Now, while this is all still very wet and pliable, we're going to go back to our crown brush, simply wipe it on the paper towel, get that excess paint off. In fact, you can kind of roll it off, the same way you loaded it, roll the paint out of the brush. And we're going to pick up a little highlight value, a little sunshine, if you will, with yellow ochre. Again, work it in. A little less paint this time because we're basically tinting. We're going to come over to our clouds and lightly, with a very light touch, add in some sunshine. You don't need too much of this because I really don't want this to look as sunny as a summer day would, but we do need a little sunshine up here. Let's roll that excess paint out. And now let's come over to plum. We'll put a little bit of shading at the bottom of these clouds. Okay, the paint is still nice and soft for me, so I can come in and tint at the base of these clouds. Also note that our tinting colors separate the clouds and make them a little bit more natural and interesting. If at any point you think you've applied too much of one color, perhaps too much plum or too much yellow, and you've lost your cloud color, simply roll that loaded brush, come back in, pick up more of our cloud color, and come back and reapply over the top. I've picked up less paint this time because I'm really trying to control it. I don't want as heavy an application. Particularly in the center area of our plate, our clouds should be slightly more interesting and fade off towards the edges. I'm removing the excess paint. I'll go back to this brush, and again, I can slightly soften these colors in. Now, don't soften these out too much. Right now, they're the only thing you're looking at, but by the time we get snow and pine trees in, these clouds will look much softer than they look right now. Okay, let's go down to the horizon line. And this time, we're going to go back to the blue, again with the 50% paint, 50% water. Really work it in. Come along the top of that strong horizon line that we put in with black plum. Don't forget to drop over the edge of the plate. This is very important. We don't want our painting to just stop at the edge. We want it to roll over the edge. Come up to the base of the clouds with this color. Dampen all the way across. This is with the blue mist. And while this color is wet, I'm going back to the crown brush and I'm rolling in plum. I'm picking up a considerable amount of paint this time, like we did the first time with the clouds. We're going to start at the horizon line. We're going to start tapping. Notice you don't have to hold the brush straight up. You can slightly angle it because of the tiered hairs in the brush. It'll hold the paint. In fact, as you're working and you find that there's less paint in your brush, you can simply roll the brush a quarter turn and it'll provide more paint for you. So your heavy application is going to be at the horizon line. And as you're tapping, you're going to go up. You're going to use lighter pressure, and there's also going to be less paint in your brush. So it's going to get more delicate and lacy looking to the tops of these trees. Remember, these are cool background trees, so we don't want them to have any real definition. They're just going to serve as a backdrop for all our pine trees. Let's go back into the horizon line. Keep tapping up. You don't want to form a straight line with these trees. You want some dips and dives. So keep this in mind as you're tapping on this color. Sometimes you tend to formulate a line, and that would be exactly the wrong thing to do. Remember, this is a scene from nature, and it does give us a lot of flexibility, but it, generally speaking, doesn't have a lot of hard edges. We think soft edges when we're doing landscapes. Okay, the next value we will go into is black plum. I'm picking up a little less paint this time. Notice I didn't even clean the brush. Because I'm working in the same value, it's not necessary to wipe the brush out. Back to the horizon line. This time we want to start right on that heavier black plum line that we put in. This will conceal that heavy line. It will no longer serve as a strong guide. It's not necessary. And we will only go about halfway up into the plum area. And by tapping from bottom up, most of the application is to the horizon line. You can probably hear me tapping the surface. That's the amount of pressure that I'm using. And it's amazing how much paint will actually come out of this brush, considering how much you're picking up on your palette and how much you plan to apply onto the surface. Don't worry if some areas get slightly darker or lighter. It tends to give you more of a dimensional appearance. Just remember, you don't want to come all the way up to the top of the plum trees. You only want to come up 2/3 or 1/2 of the way. Really keep that horizon line the darkest area. And the way we can do that is after we've tapped in our black plum, we can come back and lightly drag the brush across between the base of the trees and that horizon line. Now, as a friend of mine said, you don't have to make a career out of this. These are background trees. Once you've completed all across your horizon line, and don't forget, you want to wrap around those slight edges of your plate. I'm going to move over to an illustration board now. And this is what your trees would look like if they were completed around your building. I also would like you to notice that I have added a little bit of detail with suggested branches and trunks placed in with the liner brush with the black plum. Now, you may or may not find this necessary, but I'm a detail person and I kind of like the feeling of those looking a little bit more like trees. So I went ahead and did a little line work. Now for our pine trees, we need some fresh paint. And this is evergreen. And we're going to switch over to our blade. And we're going to be working with that tip I was talking to you about, up on this point. We're going to take that point and we're going to poke it into the edge of the paint. I'm picking up quite a bit of paint so that you can see quite a bit has been collected on that corner. Now you're going to come over to the surface. And to create your pine tree, we're going to start at the base, which is the fattest, the biggest part of the tree. And we're going to use a pouncing technique. And we place the tip down, we keep it in one spot. Then we move off to one side, come back to center, and move off to the other side. I'm going to pick up a little bit more paint. This might be a little difficult for you to see against the plum, so I'm going to move down into a lighter area to show you. It's tapping in, moving off to one side, coming back, moving off to the other side, coming back. And we're going to continue to move in this side-to-side fashion, picking up paint. Depending on the size tree that you're working on, you'll have to stop and pick up more paint. So as you work up, you're going to swing to the left and the right a little less, a little less, a little less, and a little less. And you're going to formulate a pine tree. We're going to continue to do that all along the horizon line. The one thing that I suggest that you do is vary the sizes of your pine trees. Let's look over at the finished painting. Notice how there's some tall and some very short. Mix those different heights in, because the ones that are shorter tend to look as though they're further away from you, whereas the ones that are taller are coming slightly closer. I am not at this time painting these 3 trees, the one behind the house or the 2 in front of the barn. I'm doing these distant pine trees along the horizon line. Now you would continue painting your pine trees in and behind your barn. And it's strange because once you get a flow going, it seems the faster you move, the more realistic these trees look. It's kind of fun. It's kind of like scribble art. If you've ever done doodling, this is kind of a doodle thing where you dab and swing and dab and swing. And as you lift, there's less paint on your brush, and you're going to vary the sizes of your pine trees. Right now, we don't have to worry about bringing these pine trees down past the horizon line. We'll take care of that a little bit later. Let's stay right in that plum area. Let's not get below it. And remember, you're painting a bigger tree. Simply pick up more paint. I need to put a little bit more paint on this tree. I hope this is a little bit more visible for you. As soon as I get some snow on it, I'm sure it'll start to pop. Okay. Now what we're going to do is take a liner brush and pick up a little highlight flesh, which is going to be our snow throughout the painting. This is a very light flesh color, and it appears to be an off-white in your painting. I found that using pure white is just a bit too powerful. This has a softer effect, more pleasing, a little bit more romantic too for a snow scene. Let's go back to our pine trees. We're going to lay the snow on top of these pine boughs that we've just created, but we're going to work mainly with the tip of the brush. We're going to put the brush down, and as we move out the top of the branch, we're using a dabbing motion. And then we'll swing back off to the other side. Now, you don't want to do this all the way up because it will end up looking like a very primitive tree. What we want to do is create a slightly lacy appearance. So we would work in some areas and maybe skip up and tap off in other areas. And by making this a slightly more irregular application, it looks more natural. And as we get up to the tippy top, we don't want too much paint in our brush because we want to get that little point up on the top. Now again, depending on the size of the tree, would indicate to you about how much snow should be going on that tree. If you're doing a smaller tree, you're going to be a bit more delicate. And this is almost like dancing your brush, putting it down and letting it do a little tap dance across the surface of the pine tree. And again, it seems faster the rhythm you get going, the more natural it looks. I think we need to move to a slightly smaller liner brush to get some nice points to the top of these trees. So I'm going to pick up a little of the highlight flesh, go back up here to the top, place ourselves a nice pointy pine tree top. Notice as I'm working with the smaller brush, you can really see it's again kind of a scribble stroke. And it just creates this very lovely lacy appearance with the snow on the trees. Let's move over to our buildings now. I've done a larger building for you because the ones in the original painting are very small, and I'm hoping that this will provide a good visual for you. Now, I've tried to keep these houses very basic and very simple because they're really in the background. Our main show for this particular painting is not necessarily the buildings, but our fence and our mailbox and these lovely pine boughs that are branching in from the side of the plate. So we're going to keep these very simple, and we're going to paint them in the same values and in the same colors. Now we need to establish some corners on our brush. And as much as I've eliminated a lot of floated color in this particular piece, at this point we need to float some color. So we're going to pick up an appropriate sized angle brush, dampen it. I'm going to pick up a little burnt sienna on the corner of the brush. This is how I like to blend a side load. I pick up a nice little dollop of paint on that high corner. I bring it over to my palette. I lay the brush back in my hand, and I work it in, work it in, work it in. But I don't forget the other side. I flip it over, and I work the other side in. And I'll do this several times. Just stay in the same spot. You don't want this paint to walk too far across the brush and ruin this nice clean edge with just water on it. If you're afraid you might have a little bit too much paint on the brush, come over here on your paper towel and just test a stroke. See how the blend looks to you. Come back to your surface. Remember this big round brush we were talking about? It also serves as an eraser if we make a mistake. We're going to keep this handy just in case we make a mistake. Plus, we're going to have clean water on this brush. If there's no water on it, we can't erase a mistake. So I'm just going to blot the excess water out of that brush. And I'm going to dampen the front of my barn. Laying that blended brush along the roof line, on the siding. Notice how I'm patting the shading on? I pat it on first, and then lastly I'll pull lightly over the surface to get a nice blend. Then I'm going to drop down to the front of this little shed, which I'm going to dampen with clean water, and I'm going to shade the corner next to the front of the barn. Now I'm going to move over to the side of the barn. Need to dampen that with clean water. Make sure you don't flood the surface. If you flood the surface, the float is simply going to float away. We want it to stay put. We just simply want to dampen the surface, not wet it. And again, pat it on, stretch the paint, and then go back and lightly pull over it. Let's drop down to the house now and establish some corners here. Again, dampen the end of the house. And pull, pat, and pull, and then lightly pull back over. I'm going to repeat this again down on the corner. Pat and pull, and then a light drag over. I'm going to continue to do this to create dimension under the roof lines, at the corners. It's also creating shadow and light source direction. Never try to go back into a damp area and go over an opposing line. You will lift the line that hasn't set and dried yet. So don't make that classic mistake. Let's go back over to the barn. The surface is dry, so we're able to dampen it with clean water. I'm going to need to reload my angle brush. Same thing, burnt sienna. Blended both sides. Dampen the front of the barn. Let's catch that other angle along our roof. And notice the roof dips down. This is a hip roof barn. It has that sharp angle in it. Catch this little edge here. You can use this as a little mop to clean up any little line that you might leave there. And then continue on down this corner. Now we really want the front of the barn to look darker than the side of the barn because our light source is coming from our upper right. So normally the front side would be darker, not the side facing us. Notice there's a little cupola at the top of the barn. We need to float a little color underneath. Work mainly with your edge on this one. Float a little shading under there. And our little chimney, that would be floated next to the roof at the base. All right, our house is dry. We can come back and finish shading along the roof line. Pat it in. And then soften and pull. And back across this way. And our final angle over here. Notice that I didn't put any shading on the far right edges. Our light source would be hitting that edge of the buildings, here and here. But we should float a darker shadow on this back edge, away from our light source. Up on our roof, we also need to give that a little bit of definition. I'm going to be using the same brush and black plum. Remember, I poke the paint, pick up a nice dab, blend on the palette, both sides. If you properly load your brush, it should carry you through a lot of floats. Tap to see how much paint I have on the brush. Again, I'm going to come back, dampen the roof of the barn. Notice again the angle of this barn. Again, being a hip roof, there's this strong angle. Let's set that now. Let's shade along that line. We want a softer float this time because this is a lighter, appears to be a lighter and a cooler value than our siding. Also, there's going to be snow here, so we don't have to put too much definition on our roofs. Let's go over here to the eaves section. All you have to use is the corner of this brush and tap in a small amount of shading, because this part is towards the back, away from the light source. Let's go over to our house. We have a little triangular section here. Shade along the edge of that triangle, patting it on, pull and lift, and we have an eave to the back. Now, generally speaking, I don't just stop here. It, to me, needs to have a little cast shadows. Maybe a cloud is forming a shadow on the rooftop. So I come back and I lightly tint or float a little of this black plum to make the flat portion of our roof a little bit more interesting. There. Now you're ready to detail your house. Notice that I've already base coated the doors and the windows and the detail angles with burnt sienna. While our first shading is drying, I'm going to go back in and add some shading to our doors and windows now. We're going to need to go to a smaller angle brush. I'm still using black plum. I'm going to work that in. And we're going to float this color to the top. Just pat it in. Every window. Use the clean edge of your brush to clean up anything that might have slipped over the edge. And to your door. We'll come over and do the same thing to our barn. This, of course, has an angled door, just like it has an angled roof. So we're going to make sure we capture that angle to the top. And we have one small window up to the top. Now at this time, you can look back at areas that have dried and decide, do I need another coat of burnt sienna? Do I need a little bit more shading? And at this point, I think the shading could be intensified just a bit more on the angles of the roof. So I'm going to go back in with another application. Same procedure. We're just going to float that color in over a clean, dampened surface. I like to use this round brush because if I don't like the float, I can quickly erase it, or I can use the point of the round to kind of clean up maybe an overlap somewhere that I didn't want it to overlap into. This is better. We need this angle to show a bit more. Also, this angle needs to be good and strong on our house to separate the two roofs. Notice how this came down into the house? I can just take my round brush and erase it. Let's go up to the cupola. It's got a triangular top to it. And I think all you need to do is just float a little bit of plum to the back. And if it carried over a little bit too far, erase off a little highlight. All right, now we need to strengthen our shadows on our barn and our house. Just make sure that your first application is dry, or you could lift it at this point. Let's redampen. And we're going to strengthen the shadows in the strongest, darkest areas. And don't be afraid that this comes over the yellow, because actually purple will dull and soften yellow. If you know your color theory and your color wheel, this is the companion color for yellow. In any area that seems to be screaming at you, this black plum is going to tame it right down. We need to do the same thing over here to the dark side of our house. I'm going to slip down to this corner. Obviously, you don't want the strong burnt sienna line work guide to end up showing. You want your black plum shading to really cover up any line work that you had in there previously as your guide. Now here's a corner that I initially missed. Let's go back. You need to put the burnt sienna in first and establish this corner. Okay, we need to let this dry, but you would continue to build your values that way. Now, we need a little detailing, and this is where you're going to want to go to that smaller detail brush. And our detailing on our windows, the framework, is going to be yellow ochre. So we're going to need to dampen a little water into this paint so it'll flow nicely out, because this is where you really want to have some good control. If you're used to using a Tole bridge to steady your hand, by all means you should use one at this point. Or simply get a good grip on that liner brush down near the ferrule where you can really work with the tip. Place it down and draw the stroke towards you. Go over. I like to do one side of the window frame and then come over and do the opposite side. Do all of my verticals. And then I'll come back and do my horizontals. Now, to do the horizontals, you'll want to turn your piece so that you can see where the brush is going. You probably need to pick up a little bit more paint at this time. Just make sure that it's thin enough so it'll flow out for you. You'll know right away if it doesn't want to budge. Just add a little bit more water. Now, if you choose, you can put window panes in. If you decide to do that, they really should be slightly finer and a little bit more delicate than the framework. Because we don't want people to look at those window panes, we just want to know that they're there. And if you like to be a detailist, this is something that you would definitely want to do. Again, I like to put in my horizontals about halfway through the window. Then I turn the piece. Now it's up to you. I think it looks a little bit primitive to put just one line through at this point. I think it looks a bit more realistic if we go with two. Now, if you go with two, obviously you're going to have to put more horizontals. Think of your window frames at home. How many sections does your window have? Is it a 9 or a 6? Oops, see, a little bit too much water ran down from the ferrule. That can happen. Just wipe it off, start again. Okay, let's go back to that horizontal. Now this is strictly up to you. Some people like to make the center horizontal a bit heavier. It looks like where the two windows separate. You could go back in. Make that slightly stronger. Now over on our barn, it's a barn. We don't have to get this fancy with the barn, but you do need your framework. Again, let's shape out. Shape out our door and our window. If you've gotten a little rough with your side loading or your base coating, this is a nice trick to clean it up. Okay, let's go over to our snowbanks. We're going to be working with Blue Mist and Plum. You're going to want to go, you're going to want to go back to your larger angle brush and a smaller angle brush. Again, I'm going to use 50-50% paint and water. And with this other angle brush, I'm going to side load with Plum. So this is my two brush technique. We've got two brushes, and we're going to work with them together. Going over to this area to the left of the house, we want to keep this very dark and shadowy. It's away from our light source. So you can use your pattern as a guide, but we need to dampen. And this we want to keep very smooth near the horizon line. Again, we don't want a straight horizon line. This is a chance to get those little dips and dives in. But it is a smooth line, not a choppy line. We don't want this to be choppy because it's snow. It's not sand or gravel. Let's slide around to the front of the house too, right up to the edge of our pathway. Now obviously we're going to need some shading at the corner of this house. So with our plum, let me turn this sideways. Lay it right against this wet paint. And by patting and pulling, it'll soften right in. Come down to the corner of the house. Now, angle off. But as you angle off, think of little hills and valleys. You're making snowdrifts, snowbanks by doing this. Don't worry about some little choppy strokes that are left in there. That's not a problem for us. Turn this back around. I'm picking up a little bit more plum on my brush. And along the end of the house here, I'm going to cast a shadow. Just pat it in. And right in the front of the house, the shadow wouldn't go next to the house. It goes next to the pathway. And notice there's little zigs and zags. You just need to touch in a few of those zigs and zags. Let's go back over to the edge of our road, and we can place in a few of these little shadowed areas in there. Now let's go back and strengthen this one that we put behind the house. Pick up a little black plum, blend it in our brush, and let's darken that just a bit, especially near the house. Good, dark, strong shadow. Pat it off. Let it just kind of fade away. Let's turn this back around. We're going to be doing the same thing in front of the barn. I want these snow areas to be very cool. I'm going to continue right along the base of the pine trees and the barn, just staying in this upper area. Still using that thin blue mist to dampen my area. And while it's wet, I'm going to go back to the plum, work it in, again, next to the house, and pull away from the house. And as you pull, dip, and lift, and dip. Don't be afraid to go back into these dip areas and strengthen them, because that's where your strongest shadows would lie, and next to your house. Careful of the roof line. Now this side we wouldn't put the black plum shadow on because it's facing the sun, but we do need some strong shadows on our snow. Now let's put a few highlights. That I use yellow ochre for, and I'm going to blend it into my brush. Now if your paint has start to set up, you could do this in two processes. Allow your shading to dry, and then go on and add your highlights. If it has started to set up, just go back in, re-dampen the tops of your snowbanks. Wherever you know you're going to need a little highlight. That would be on the areas that bump up. So let's float a little sun on the top of those mounds of snow. Maybe a little bit back towards our horizon. Not too much happening back there. Now we would continue to use this process through our snowbanks in our mid-ground area. The only difference will be we've got a road here to consider. So we're going to come up to the edge. Apply that wet blue mist and paint out our tree. We don't need that there anymore. And back to plum. And let's create some shadows at the edge of the road and pull. One thing you have to be careful of here. Don't make this look like even waves on the ocean. We want to break up all these hills and valleys, so to speak, of our shadows, make it a bit more interesting. So some will appear flatter and some a little higher, but don't make them all in a row. It's kind of easy to do that as you're painting along in this wet-on-wet technique to duplicate something that you've just painted above it. So that's a little warning for you. You can use my pattern as a general guide, too, as to where you might want to place these snowdrifts and snowbanks. And here you're definitely going to want to add plum because you're coming more forward and you're going to need more depth in your painting. So be sure to add in plenty of shadows into those valleys. Don't be afraid to come up next to your road and put a little darker shadow there. Now when you come into the highlight, skip the yellow ochre for now. We want to kind of make this a separate area because it's coming closer to us. We want the area back near the buildings to remain very cool and distant. But as we're coming forward, we want to get a little brighter. So we're going to pick up our highlight flesh, which is acting as our snow color today. Blend that. Come in. Don't worry if this looks a bit bright to you right now. We're going to have some toning techniques I'm going to teach you a little later in the painting. Just remember, we don't want this to look all the same. And basically, as you come forward, you should get a bit bolder and a bit heavier with your highlights and your shadows. You would continue on to paint that way in your snowbank areas off to the right and down to the end of your roadway. I want to talk a little bit about the pathway in the road now because we're going to want to finish this area quickly so we can move on to more important areas of the painting. This is done with burnt sienna. Again, I like to keep my wet, clean round brush handy in case I make any mistakes or I don't like the applications. It's either too strong or perhaps not placed correctly. And I'm going to go back into this angular brush and we're going to start out with burnt sienna. Now the difference here is we're going to dampen this surface first like we did our buildings because I don't want this burnt sienna to be attracting too much attention away from our snow. Our snow is definitely more important than the road and the pathway. Now starting back near the house, place the brush down. Well, first let me dampen a little bit with water. Place the chisel edge down and using a zigzag motion, go across the path. And you will do this for the entire road. Now, I would suggest that you work just in perhaps one section at a time. If you think you're going to run out of moisture on your surface, don't carry this burnt sienna over the entire road. Just work up near the house and then perhaps move down to another area. Because while this is wet, I'm going to side load a little yellow ochre. I'm going to drag a little sunshine. Here and there, not evenly, but here and there, as breaks, where the sun maybe is breaking through the clouds and hitting our road or our path. It's not necessary to come back into this small area. It's fine the way it is, just with the burnt sienna. Now, while this is still wet, a few cast shadows tucked into some of these dips. Now, we're painting on the road, not on the snow. See how that makes the drift a bit more profound and seems to lift up the snowbank. Okay, let's move on now. In this painting, we have our buildings completed. We have our pine trees, clouds, snowbanks, and we have washed in our road and highlighted and shaded it. This foreground area down in here, I'd like to touch base with you on that. So I'm going to switch back over to this piece. And I'm going to use that large flat brush. I'm going back to the blue-gray mist. Again, I want this paint to be fairly soupy. We're going to apply this all along the edge of our road. Now, you don't have to stay within your pattern lines. In fact, if you've used a graphite line, you're going to want to cover it up at this point. And I call this choppy brush strokes. Don't worry about the way they look right now. Remember, drop over the edge and pick up plum. 50% water to 50% paint. This will go in the middle area. And last, we put black plum down here in this little section, going right over the edge. Leave this very patchy. Now, while our blue is still a little wet, I'm going to touch in a little bit of sunshine. Okay, set that on the side and allow it to dry. And when it has dried, you're going to trace on your fence and your mailbox, your bush, and your pine branches that are coming in from the side. Let's work on our fence first. We're going to start with the crown brush. We're also going to use, again, what I call my eraser, the round brush. We're going to pick up the burnt sienna by laying the brush back in your hand and fully loading the sides of the brush. Now, this is a dry brush technique. And we're going to drag this down the surface. This is going to look like old wood. Remember to go over the edge of the plate when necessary. Go back and reload when you can sense when the paint has run out of the brush. But the trick is not to pick up a lot of paint. Notice how the natural hair leaves trails of paint. This is ideal for this technique. And you would continue to do this. And you would also go horizontally for your rails. Now, to make a shaded effect, we're going to pick up some black plum. Our light source is coming from the right, so we want to drag this mostly to the left and to the bottom of our rails. And you would continue on that way. Also, you can highlight. Just wipe the brush. Don't go into water. Just wipe it. Pick up some yellow ochre and go down the right side. And to the tops of your rails if necessary. And I also like to put a little cool tint. Go back to that blue mist. Now this you're going to drag over a little bit easier because it tends to make this look like old wood. The detailing on here is done with black plum to separate where your rails insert into your posts. Let's go up to our mailbox. It's been base coated with the blue mist and my little red flag. My outline work has been done with black plum. I'm going to pick up some plum using the blade. Start at the top of the mailbox and drag down. This is going to add just a little bit of interest. Remember to slightly curve or go straight, depending on the surface you're dragging across. Wipe the brush. A little bit of burnt sienna will make this an old, maybe a little rusty mailbox. There. Now we're going to apply some snow to the tops. Using the tip of the blade, come over into your highlight flesh, scoop up the paint on that tip, and you're literally going to lay it and dab it across the top of the mailbox and to the top of your flag. You would do the same to the tops of each rail. And definitely some nice heavy applications up here to the tops of your post. Now, how much snow is going to be up to you. You want to drag it down the sides a little bit. You want to pull it down the rail a little bit more. This is going to be a personal choice, how much snow this is going to have, where the wind has perhaps kind of blasted it onto the sides. Or you can have a very controlled application. Definitely need some snow. Definitely some snow down at the bottom kind of scumble that in with the tip of this brush. Kind of work a little bit up onto the bottom of the posts. Notice how I have already done the line work for my bush off to the left and to my pine boughs off to the right. That was burnt sienna, line work detailing with black plum. You would do the same application of snow onto your bush. You would start first with the tip of the blade, and almost like we did our clouds, but a lighter application this time. Lay this off the tips of the bush. Then you could come back in while this is still a little damp. Pull a little plum shadows to the bottom here and there. And again, maybe a little yellow highlight to the top. It's kind of nice to personalize your mailbox. Maybe you want to put a family name on it, or the name of a street, something that's more familiar to you. Let's move over to our pine branches. We're going to be moving back into green. So I'm going to take some fresh evergreen, and I'm going to work with the chisel edge. I'm going to pull some paint out and work it into this chisel edge. Now to form the needles, let me turn the plate just a little bit. We're going to place the brush down and slightly pull. And this is going to form our pine needles. You would continue to do this throughout your branches. But don't hide your branches. They have to peek out here and there. I know pine trees have a lot of needles, but in this case, we're going to hold back a little bit. Now, I would go back into black plum. Same technique, picking up on the chisel edge of the blade. And I'm going to formulate some little V sections. These are the darker shadows that are going to appear underneath the snow application. Wipe the brush, and go back into my green, put a few more needles around, a little darker, heavier application this time. Okay, we've set up some shadows and some needles. Now we need our snow. I'm simply going to wipe this brush. I'm not cleaning it. It's okay if a little bit of color carries on through. It'll look a little bit more natural. I'm really scooping up quite a bit of highlight flesh on the tip of this brush. And again, working with the tip, lay it. And let it drip a little over. Now here you're going to want a more deliberate application and kind of move that tip around a little bit. Allow some of the needles to poke out. Maybe drop over these V sections. Be a little lacy with it. And again, like the bush, put a little plum shading, a little yellow highlighting. Another little trick I like to do is leaving a scant amount of the highlight flesh on my brush, working a little bit of it off in my palette. Again, working with that chisel edge. Just touch and lightly pull. It makes a lovely frosted appearance, like some of the needles have caught a little bit of ice. And you would continue to do that throughout your branches. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about glazing. After your painting has dried, let's go over to the finished painting. I'd like to point these out to you. Notice the strong shadows on the mailbox and how they angle because of our light source direction. Also, there's been a stronger shadow placed to the back of the mailbox. There's also a shadow crossing over from the edge of the flag diagonally across the mailbox again. These are things that make an importance to a dimensional painting. I've also placed a glaze along the left side and to the bottom of the rails. All this glazing has been done with this round brush with a very thin application of black plum. Your underpainting, because it's dry, will show right through and come to you. You won't lose that dry underpainting. This will only enhance your painting. You can do the same thing with any of the shadows in your snowbanks. Pull it in or pull it back along from the edge of your road. Notice how there's tints on the bottom areas of these clumps of snow that we placed on our pine branch. Also, you can come back and maybe strengthen some of the shadows on the snow from your bush. You can cast shadows behind each post, this thin application of black plum. Also, notice that the backs of our house and barn have been glazed. Also, the background trees have been glazed. You can also glaze the bottom of these larger pine trees in front of your barn and off to the back of your house. If you like a little touch of icicles dripping off the roof, that's nice. It can be done with a liner brush. I would suggest you use blue mist to the back or cooler sections of the house, and then move into your highlight flesh along the front edges of your roof and barn too. Notice that most of the barn is hidden behind that large tree, but there's enough of it still peeking through, so you don't want to completely lose that barn when you paint this tree, so please be careful. If you want a sunnier appearance to your snowy day, I would suggest you float another glaze, same technique with very thin yellow ochre, to the tops of your snowbanks, the tops of your snow, on your fence post in your mailbox, and to your bushes, and also the roofs of your house. If you don't like that look, you might like to spatter a little bit of snow and have a snowy day. And I want to thank you very much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure painting with you. I hope you enjoy this new technique.